The Social Network came out in 2010. Fast-talking, sharp insights, and not afraid to have unlikable protagonists. This was to be expected because it was written by Aaron Sorkin, writer of The West Wing, A Few Good Men, Moneyball, and my particular favourite, Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip with Matthew Perry. I know, not so many people know that one. The story in the movie, in my opinion, was about a young, angry, slightly pathetic man who started a website to spite the women around him. As I'm sure you already know, this man-child was Mark Zuckerberg. Now, I'm not saying that everything in this movie is true. In fact, it of course has been fictionalized and has inaccuracies. But there are cutting observations that show many truths about Facebook, its founding story, and the characters involved. Today, we'll clarify what was real and what was included for our entertainment, just in time for you to be ready to watch The Social Reckoning when it comes out later this year. Hi, I'm Dr Becky Sage, and in this wider series, I asked the question, is it Marmite? For those who don't know, that means, do we love it or do we hate it? And we asked that question about many different businesses. Now, what I'm trying to do here is not actually further polarize, but rather dig deep to see if we can find nuance. Maybe even some understanding, because that might help us to build better businesses or technology organizations in the future. This video is episode 1 in my deep dive into Meta. Now, I don't know that there are many people that will tell you they love Meta these days, but people sure do still use it, and I'll put my hand up and say I still have an Instagram account and a WhatsApp. Maybe you do too. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you still use these tools despite feeling dubious about the business and its founders / leaders? Over the next 5 episodes, we will explore the growth, the impact, the controversies that have plagued 20+ years of this company. As usual, I will begin with the founding story, but as Aaron Sorkin and David Fincher have already done what many people consider to be an unbeatable telling of this story, I thought there's no point reinventing the wheel. So I rewatched The Social Network, and today I will recap the major plot points and fact check the big moments in the movie so that we can understand what actually happened at the founding of Facebook. And hey, if this isn't the first one of these series that you've watched, then please do remember to subscribe to this channel. It's pretty new. Obviously, if you haven't watched this video yet, I have not earned your subscription yet. Now, before getting into the chronological story, I want to jump right to the end, where Rashida Jones, who plays a junior defense lawyer on Mark Zuckerberg's team in one of the legal disputes, which we'll get into in a minute, says, creation myths need a devil. Now today, if we're telling the Facebook creation myth, who actually is the devil? Let's line up the cast so we can make our predictions. Maybe the obvious one would be Mark Zuckerberg. He's played by Jesse Eisenberg in the movie. If you think it's him, pop it in the comments. Perhaps it's the Winklevoss twins. You'll get to know them more in a minute. Both played by Armie Hammer. Then we've got Divya Narendra. Perhaps it's Sean Parker, the Napster founder, who is played by Justin Timberlake. Then we've got a few women in this movie, not very many, but there are a few female characters. We have Erica Albright, who is a fictional character, but most believe she is based on somebody called Jessica Alona. And then there's another fictional female character called Christy Lee, played by Brenda Song. Then we had Eduardo Saverin, who I like to refer to as Spider-Man. He is played by Andrew Garfield. I'm not very original in my nicknames, but there are more. We're not there yet. Peter Thiel shows up in this movie, played by Wallace Langham. And then we have
Dustin Moskovitz,
played by Justin Mazzello. He is the roommate and co-founder of Facebook. Someone we don't hear all that much about because he's got something to hide, or because there aren't really any stories to tell. Keep watching to see who I think the real devil is in this creation myths. If you have seen any of my other episodes, then you definitely know already. And let me know what you think in the comments. So, let's get on with the story. So this whole movie is based on a book called The Accidental Billionaire that was written by Ben Mesrich in 2009. It was written with Eduardo Saverin's cooperation, so if you think that he is a sympathetic character in this story, then that might partly be why. The film was directed by David Fincher. The Accidental Billionaires seems like a really good prequel title. It's not a prequel to Sarah Wynne Williams' book Careless People. Accidental Billionaires, Careless People. And we will talk more about Careless People in the latter part of this series. We'll go into the next episode. So the movie opens with two young people sitting in a bar having a very quippy, fast conversation. Talking at the speed of sound is exactly what we'd expect from an Aaron Sorkin movie. There's also some depth in this conversation. When we were watching the movie, my friend was like, "This is like having a conversation with you." And I was like, "Well, thank you. I talk like I'm in an Aaron Sorkin show." But I really hope he didn't mean that you're as assholey as Zuckerberg, because that's what's coming across in this opening scene. There's some great commentary online about individual scenes from this movie, and in this opening scene they're kind of talking at cross purposes a little bit. He's not really engaging, he's just got this deep thought that he wants to share. And it's really all about getting into Harvard's final clubs, building his reputation. They're elite, historically all male, and a place that people want to go to so they can be part of a specific crowd. What Mark says in the movie is that he wants to do something good in order to get into the club, and that's going to allow him to have a better life. Already, all of this brought up lots of questions for me. First of all, is this fast quippiness, 19-year-olds talking like this, a normal thing? Was this true at this time? If you go back and watch some of the earlier interviews with Mark Zuckerberg, he's not as fast talking as this, not as sharp. But also, even though other people consider him to be a little bit halting in some of those early interviews, I think that what's coming across there is, first of all, probably somebody still getting used to being in the media, but also, to me, he does seem like he's smart, he's thinking, he's not as fast, but that's different from being in a social situation. The other question is, like, was he really talking to girls? That's such a dumb question. Sorry, I apologize for saying it in the first place. But, that, you know, as I was sitting there, I was thinking, is this the same as this person who's spending all their time coding, all their time at night, getting into coding projects? And that's really like his past. That's how he got into Harvard in the first place. He'd already done so much that was focused on computing. He initially taught himself to code, then he had like some more advanced tutoring on it. He did loads of different projects for his family, for other projects. Before he even got into Harvard, that was part of what helped him get into Harvard. So when you kind of see like, oh, the opening scene is basically him on a date, that sort of feels a little bit weird. But also we know that he did actually he met his wife when he was at Harvard, he started dating her then. So it's not like he was a complete recluse or anything like that. What is called into question is how true this actual character is, and whether or not anything like this actually happened, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, we can't go through this movie without pulling out some of the brilliant lines. One of the things that Erica Albright says is, dating you is like dating a stairmaster. Imagine dating somebody who's relentless, exhausting, burning up energy, always doing constant work but not moving forwards in any way. Perhaps not even any emotional reward from doing that. I really hope that when my friends said, "This is like you," that they didn't mean that. They probably did. I feel that way about myself a lot of the time. Relentless, always working, always pushing forward, and never seeing any forward momentum. Now, as I said, a lot of this scene is about setting up the idea that he wants to get into the final clubs. And again, initially, I watched Social Network a very, very long time ago, and then I've since read Careless People and various other, obviously all the other things that are going on with Meta, with Facebook. And to me, I was like, what's this all about? This is interesting, because in Careless People, it sounds like the kind of politics side of things isn't something that Mark is interested in. So this motivation to get into the final clubs does seem to be something that is true, and also makes me think that perhaps some of the decisions are not as careless as we think. But what we're seeing is somebody who just wants to get into those circles of power, or maybe it's circles of money, wants to be world leading at what they do. Let's hold on to that thought. Because being a talented coder and having ambition to do something world leading probably means, as is said by Erica Albright in the script, you're probably going to be a very successful computer person. She also says girls won't like you because you're an asshole. Two things can be true at the same time. So let's move on. In the movie, what we're led to believe is this makes him a bit angry. He comes out of the date and then he's like going into his dorm room and his roommates are there as well. And he ends up creating this Facemash. So he takes the Kirkland dorm Facebook, as they were called at the time. So all of the students who are in this dormitory, takes their faces, takes their photos, loads them up into a database. At the same time, he's live blogging all of this stuff. And again, it's so interesting to see that there is actual live blog called Zuck on it, nonetheless. And there's a lot of real-time thoughts that are coming out about what's going on. Now, some things that are on that blog include Jessica Alona is a bitch. So we know that that sentiment was real. We don't know that the date is real. Mark Zuckerberg says it didn't happen. So I don't know why he thinks she's a bitch, but he does. He also said something along the lines, I almost want to put their faces next to farm animals and then judge them against them. What he actually did was put two faces next to each other and then have people rank them. So I don't think it really matters whether this is what happened because he was broken up with or not. Now, were there misogynistic streaks within this? It seems that there was an outcry about sexism, so probably yes. Because the other thing we have here at this time is actual reporting from the Crimson newspaper at Harvard. So there is kind of lots of real-time different perspectives available for us to be able to see what actually happened at this time. And of course, none of this is new news right now. This is really just me establishing this story. As the movie depicts, this website was shut down very, very quickly. Apparently, according to the movie, there was an outage because it overloaded Harvard's systems. And the part about hacking other Facebooks from the other houses, the other dorms, apparently they being the roommates, which did include, we've also seen at this point in the film, Dustin and Eduardo. So they wrote a script to pull the data from these other Facebooks. Now, these were images that were already available to all the students, but presumably nobody gave any permission for this. They obviously didn't give any permission for this. Now, all of the numbers thrown out in the movie are not really correct. There were 22,000 votes from 450 users on the site, and it didn't crash everything, it was shut down. But the implication in the movie is that there was this massive influx of users and crashed all of Harvard's systems, and Mark Zuckerberg was a little bit proud of that in the movie. Also, through all this, there's kind of a clip that shows a comparison between the final clubs, girls dancing in bras. Does that happen in places like this? Probably, I guess. Versus him coding in the dorms. And for me, I think that this is actually foreshadowing something that is a positive of social media. And yes, I do think there are positives of social media, before you just think this is one big takedown. And I will go into much more detail on that in future episodes. But what we're seeing here is the old school way of networking, of being around people and engaging with people, versus a new way, one that is online, that allows maybe different types of people to be able to engage, to find their own communities. So That's what that scene feels like a little bit. I recognise that the final clubs do not represent every single social interaction. So as we move into the next phase of the film, what we see is that Mark Zuckerberg became very used to being in board hearings, in courtrooms, in some kind of trials or depositions very early on in his career. So there was a board hearing after the whole Facemash thing, because of course there was this outcry. People were not happy with what he was doing on that. And isn't that wild? People already shouting out about these things. And it was halted. It was halted by Harvard, and there was this board hearing, which he did survive. He did carry on at Harvard after this. So now we see the introduction of the Winklevoss twins, the Winklevi, as I don't know, I like to call them, which is double Army Hammer. There's quite a lot, right? As you will see, this movie has some problematic, both real characters and some of the actors as well. And when the Winklevosses come in, they're proposing to Mark Zuckerberg, because as he's made this splash, they're like, oh, he actually does know what he's doing. He can code things. Maybe we can use him for something. And they had this idea around the Harvard Connect. And when asked, how is this different to Friendster or MySpace? The answer is that this has got a degree of exclusivity. So again, we're doing this comparison to the final clubs, right? Going, how do we make something where people can be part of something online, but you have to show that you deserve to be there? And we should say that Divya Narendra is part of all of these conversations as well. He was there with the Winklevoss twins. And honestly, I'd forgotten that he was part of this story before I went back and watched this again. But he's actually quite a driving force, according to the movie. And actually, if you look at his future career after all of this, he's done quite a lot of things which show that maybe he was really the entrepreneurial-minded or driven one. So then they really give us the pitch, and there's a bit of an interplay going on here between what's going on with the Winklevoss twins versus what's an extension of Facemash and something that Mark's working on in the first place. And what they're saying is, imagine the entire social experience of being in college and putting it online. And you have to know the people on the site in order to get in. Again, this mirroring of the final clubs. So in the movie, what I'm reading is when Saverin gets invited into a final club, which some say was because he had money, and Mark Zuckerberg was not, this was a way for him to create his own type of exclusivity. And as we talk about exclusivity, perhaps I'm speaking too soon, but it's really interesting to me that one of the driving forces ultimately from Facebook was just like, how do we get as many people as possible onto this platform? Just people, data, 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 like the billions metric was a really important one. So we've kind of gone from something that's exclusive to something that is like, we need to get everyone on here because, well, it's going to help the individuals that built it. The founder, the CEO, have more of an exclusive life. Now, according to Mark and Eduardo, they didn't really have much to do with the Harvard Connect, but there are plenty of records out there now that say that there were lots of emails that went back and forth. At least the impression that he is working on building the Harvard Connect or being part of that at the same time as creating the Facebook. Now, it was also around about this time that they realized that they would need some startup cash. Initially, in the form of a $200 Linux box, but that would actually grow quite quickly. This is really how they position Eduardo's role in the company. Now, we all know that for startup teams, even if you've got, okay, this person over here is doing the coding, this person's doing the money, it's not necessarily as simple as that. So I always think it's kind of a bit unfair to paint somebody's role, even if they're just the money person. It doesn't feel like that was necessarily the case here in terms of Eduardo Saverin's role. Just being around somebody, being somewhere, you know, being there to bat ideas. Mark Zuckerberg might think he doesn't need those kind of things, and he never needed it, and it wasn't really of any value. But again, I'm foreshadowing what's going to happen next. Now, one of the statements that gets made in this is we're going to need a lot more money to handle the traffic. To me, this is a Chekhov's gun. So, not necessarily even in this specific story, although I guess various things happen. But what does this show? That Mark Zuckerberg has been begging for investment for processing and for infrastructure right from the beginning. This is like a micro example of what we're seeing now in the world with LLMs and other computationally intense systems just requiring this massive infrastructure. Most of the money needs, most of the challenges are all about the infrastructure required to do the compute. Back then it might have been a $200 Linux box, but now we're talking hundreds of billions for AI supercomputer clusters. So the big moment was 2004, February, when thefacebook.com got registered. I think there's something kind of interesting in this battle that goes on between the Winklevoss twins and Divya Narendra and the Facebook guys, or Mark specifically, is this whole conversation around the value of an idea. Because what they're saying is, this was our idea, we came up with it. Now, the grey area is like how worked out was a concept at what point in time. But the reality is they didn't give much to Mark Zuckerberg. And, you know, this is a conversation I have all the time with students, with aspiring entrepreneurs. An idea alone does not mean very much. It's all about whether or not you can bring that idea to fruition. And one of the things that's said is, if you were the inventors of Facebook, you would have invented Facebook. I actually can be pretty sympathetic to that now. I obviously was not in the room in the conversations, and both the movie and the depositions really do seem to indicate that, you know, there was a little bit of shadiness going on from Mark Zuckerberg, but they didn't create this thing. They didn't develop the IP. They didn't put any money into developing that IP. And actually, I think they come out of this whole thing in a very beneficial way. We'll get to that a little bit later. What does interest me about the founding of Facebook is still the motivation and the vision. And again, we'll come on to a bit more of that in the next episode. But the social part of the social network in some ways feels a bit incongruous with some of the perception of Mark Zuckerberg. But then at the same time, and looking at his childhood as well, and the whole thing where he was quite entrepreneurial and seeing different applications of coding and building different things early on, he clearly could see beyond the code. So I do think there is some strength here in understanding what is the thing that's worth spending the time on, right? What is the thing that's worth staying up late at night? So there is a driver for technical curiosity, but somehow he tapped into a zeitgeist here. And as we go through the story, we'll continue to ask the question about whether that's an actual strength of his or not. We all know that luck also plays a part in any entrepreneurial journey. So once Facebook was launched, the link was shared out to some student lists at Harvard. And there are just some discrepancies with the numbers of students who joined at a certain period of time. But apparently, I think the best source we can find is an interview that was done in the Crimson newspaper directly with Mark Zuckerberg, who said by day 4, 650 students had registered, and they were anticipating 900 by day 5. Bigger figures have been quoted in different newspapers, but that kind of 600 people number also aligns with what they said in the film. And through the whole invite only, you have to be invited kind of exclusivity thing, Facebook grew very, very quickly. They started at Harvard and then they went out to other Ivy League schools and then they went to other universities. And this is something I remember. I believe it was in 2005, maybe 2006, by the time those invites were really circulating around the UK, because I was at university at that time as well. So I remember getting my Facebook account and posting those early pictures, those status updates. Of course, by the time it came here, it was a little bit more fully formed than it was right at the beginning. From what I can remember, there was also a number at the time in terms of like what number Facebook user were you in terms of when you registered. And so again, playing into this exclusivity thing, which is something different social media platforms in particular have done over the years. It feels special to be invited. I can't remember what number I was, but I definitely was not in the first million because they hit the first million within basically a few months of launching. Another thing I found in Crimson's, let's just jump back to Facemash a minute, and because I think it's important to bring up security, copyright, privacy. So actually, apparently, Mark Zuckerberg was the one that chose to take the site down. He didn't seem to think that those issues around people's privacy were surmountable. That obviously changed before he launched Facebook. Or maybe it just didn't matter. Now, at this point, I also think it's important to mention that there were a couple of other founders in the business. Andrew McCollum did the initial web interface and graphics, and Chris Hughes was actually the only non-tech founder, and he focused on functionality, user experience, and external relations. The film doesn't mention those two co-founders at all. And the fact that so many of these co-founders left really quite early on in the journey of Facebook, even though it was just hitting its peak of success, I think says something about all the things that are going to happen next in this recap. So as I mentioned, there are two different lawsuits that are going on throughout this movie. One is with the Winklevoss twins and Narendra, and the other was against Eduardo Saverin. The movie uses the depositions, the court cases, as a narrative construct, and the wording, the dialogue, is not verbatim dialogue from the depositions. So what we're hearing and seeing in the movie isn't necessarily exactly true to what happened. So first of all, the Winklevoss and Narendra suit, they clearly were pissed off by this guy. In the movie, they're like, I want to hire the Sopranos to beat the shit out of him with a hammer. I'm sure they're not the only ones. So they were taking Mark Zuckerberg to court because they essentially said they should have a stake in Facebook because they were part of the originators. Within the depositions, the real depositions, Mark Zuckerberg would answer a lot of questions with like, I don't know, I don't recall. But there were plenty of documents that did show at least some conversation between the parties at this point in time. Now, in one of the deposition scenes, as Divya Narendra is being interviewed as part of his deposition, and they're talking about the fast rise of Facebook. And he says, Mark was the biggest thing on campus. That included 19 Nobel laureates, 15 Pulitzer Prize winners, 2 future Olympians, and a movie star. Now, of course, the Winklevoss twins were the 2 future Olympians. Spoiler. Who was the movie star? In the movie, they're like, does it matter? And they say no. But the actual movie star was Natalie Portman. She was there at the same time as Mark Zuckerberg, and she'd actually arranged a dinner with Aaron Sorkin and several other people before the movie was made in order to get some of the inside scoop on Mark Zuckerberg and the rise of Facebook. The thing I find kind of crazy about this movie, and it's actually true to real life, is that the court cases that we're seeing are happening not that long after all of the early stuff in the film and the origin of Facebook itself. The lawsuit was filed in 2004, September 2004, the Winklevoss and Divya Narendra case. So that was even before Facebook had 1 million users. The Eduardo Saverin case, which is kind of going on at the same time in the movie as this other case, was filed in April of 2005. But we should probably get to the part about why this case got filed in the first place. So the first thing is Eduardo's involvement in the early days. The movie depicts him as very much being that commercial-minded person. Mark Zuckerberg's much more kind of just curious and driven and wants to create that code and doesn't seem to care so much about the commercial sides of it. We see Eduardo talking about things like ads, which Mark Zuckerberg it just isn't thinking about. And there's so many brilliant moments in this movie I want to take you through at this point, but we would be here forever. So I'm going to accelerate a little bit. But just to say that Eduardo Saverin was there from the beginning and played an instrumental part in those early years of Facebook. But then one of our other characters comes into play, Sean Parker, the founder of Napster. And actually he's doing some quite interesting things now, but certainly in the movie, he is just not a very likable character. The movie depicts him finding out about the Facebook from a hookup he's having, and this seems to be some myth. So what actually happened wasn't quite as dramatized as it was in the movie. He just looked over the shoulder of like a roommate's girlfriend or something like that. And they were a Stanford student, and so therefore he was able to see Facebook. And because of his background in social media, he could already see that they were doing something that he was really quite interested and excited in. So he was keen to get involved. He trawled through the whole site and then eventually got in touch with them. That's not quite how the meeting happens in the movie. So then the next step in the movie is that he meets with Eduardo and Mark at a Chinese restaurant in Manhattan. And so in this scene, Sean Parker comes in and he's like this big personality. Eduardo's not really having any of it. Perhaps he sees him as a threat to his role. Perhaps he's right. And Mark, on the other hand, is like really swept away with this. A bit of like tech fangirling going on here. And again, this is a pattern that we see in the film throughout, right? If Zuckerberg holds somebody on a pedestal, then he wants to be part of it, or he wants to kind of to be good enough to be in those circles. Maybe that's filling a deep emotional void. Maybe that's just like ambition and wanting to climb and wanting to be part of something. These people who he's just read about could be his co-collaborators. And what's fascinating about this too is, again, how quickly it happened. It was in spring 2004, and they did actually meet in an Asian fusion restaurant in New York City. According to reputable sources, the connection was pretty instant between Zuckerberg and Sean Parker. And actually there is a founder lesson here, or a really interesting part of the story, which does seem to be both in the film and true. And that's that Mark Zuckerberg had this vision of wanting to keep it exclusive, wanting to continue to grow it, to focus on that part of it. And Sean Parker understood that, having come from a social media background, the limited amount of social media that was around at that time. Eduardo Saverin was thinking a lot more like founders might be thinking more commonly, which was, how do we monetize this now? Now, the reason most of the founders I work with are thinking in that way is because they feel like they have to. That's what they need in order to get investment in. But Sean Parker was coming from the Silicon Valley mindset, and actually Mark Zuckerberg also, because he read about these things, because he was knowledgeable about the tech sector and how it worked, and because he was looking at the like world leading part of it, he also was bought into this like Silicon Valley idea. How can we attract money from a big vision? We've got user traction, but we're not thinking about revenue generation at this point in time. One small little fact, which is in the movie as well, is that Sean Parker was the one who suggested dropping the from Facebook, so it was just Facebook. Now, despite putting up pretenses that he was like this wealthy entrepreneur, it was pretty well known at that point in time that he'd also lost a lot of money from his businesses. So any early startup money was not going to come from him. So what actually happened in the movie and in the true story is that the Facebook founders ended up going out to Silicon Valley. Now, in the movie, there's a lot of kind of chaotic behavior from Sean Parker, lots of like party scenes, chimneys getting pulled off houses, people jumping in pools, like all of this kind of stuff. And I don't really like these scenes at all. They kind of take me out of the movie. I guess they're kind of meant to represent like college life, young people, that sort of tech money scene. From my experience, not that I was in Silicon Valley in 2004. Just trying to think when I did start to travel out there, but it was a little bit later than that. But a lot of these scenes, I think, were put in place again to have sort of Sean Parker as this antagonist and allowing Eduardo Saverin to come in as the moral compass of the movie. And according to Business Insider in 2010, apparently most of these scenes were made up. There are also other accounts from like Dustin Moskovich and others around at that time that there was kind of a lot more focused visioning going on. However, there are certain things in those scenes that have been confirmed to be true by Mark Zuckerberg himself. There was a tiki-themed party. The zip line was real in the backyard, but most importantly, they were highly focused on coding at this time. Now, also in the movie, there's this massive party and there's a drugs bust and Parker's arrested. There's insinuations about underage girls, and none of this has been shown to be true. What did happen is that whilst on a vacation in North Carolina with some friends, the police executed a search warrant at this party and a bag of white powder was found. Parker was arrested, but never charged of anything. But anyway, we're moving slightly ahead. I promised you we were going to say what happened with Eduardo. So they all went out to Silicon Valley. There's these frat parties. And at some point, there is an emergence of perhaps one of the most despicable characters in history, Peter Thiel. And so I guess the cat's out of the bag. For me, the devil of this story, and of many, many others, is Peter Thiel. And he became the first big investor in Facebook, putting $500K into the business. And perhaps the moral compass that is Eduardo has really been put there by Aaron Sorkin to be the counterweight to the true antagonist. So part of what happened at this point in time was that Saverin was in New York. He did not go out to Palo Alto. And perhaps it was this timing more than anything else that actually meant that he ended up being pushed out of the business. Everybody who was had positioned themselves as leaders in this business at this point had ended up agreeing that Saverin was not doing his job. So Mark Zuckerberg and Sean Parker worked to create a mechanism to heavily dilute Saverin's shares when the Peter Thiel investment happened. And the point of view of those who were kind of doing the work in Palo Alto was that Saverin was also really dragging his feet. From his point of view, he wasn't getting included in things, but I can also see from the point of view of the team that was kind of doing the day-to-day work that he wasn't as involved at this time. So the thing is, there was already conflict in July of 2004. And at that point in time, Saverin, being frustrated by being left out of major corporate decisions, being kind of sidelined in favor of Sean Parker, he froze the bank account, which meant that all of Facebook's systems went down. They couldn't pay for anything, or they had to scramble to get everything moving again. And that meant that Zuckerberg's family actually put money in at that point in time. Now, I don't know about you, but I can see from the point of view of Mark Zuckerberg, of his family, of the other people around him, how frustrating that must have been. Somebody who was far away, not involved in the day-to-day, not there for all of the conversations, all of the coding, not making those decisions, then froze the bank account such that, and they had hundreds of thousands of followers at this point on the site, putting the whole thing at risk by freezing that bank account. So I actually am less sympathetic about Eduardo Saverin with this real story than I am based on what's depicted in the movie. I think all of that is what then led to them deciding to restructure in such a way that pushed, I was going to say Andrew Garfield, that pushed Eduardo Saverin out of the business. What we then see in the movie, which doesn't show all of these, all of the stuff that Eduardo is doing, and and just shows all these kind of big parties and him getting pissed off with Sean Parker taking over and everything else. We then see this like sneaky deal get drawn up, which essentially heavily diluted Eduardo Saverin's stake. So this, it appears, is somewhat real. What actually happened here was, in order to take Peter Thiel investment, they had to re-establish themselves, reincorporate as a Delaware company. So papers had to be drawn up in order to make that happen. Now, the people who drew up those papers were Facebook's lawyers, who Eduardo Saverin already had great trust in. That was not the right thing. He shouldn't have trusted them, because actually it had been orchestrated in such a way that he was heavily pushed out of the company. He should have got his own lawyers to look over it. I guess this is a simple lesson here. Always read the paperwork. We all know that lesson. We also know it doesn't happen all of the time. But so this part of the movie, actually, as depicted, is quite real. By all accounts, what happened here is that, of course, Eduardo Saverin knew that when investors came in, there would be some dilution. What he didn't know is he would be so heavily diluted while all the other co-founders weren't. And there are actual emails of Mark Zuckerberg writing to the lawyers to say to them, is there a way to do this without making it painfully obvious that he's being diluted to 10%? He also said in an email, I'm just going to cut him out and then settle with him. There'll be public fallout, but I can handle that. So, like, there are definitely elements. Like, don't forget, this is somebody in his early 20s. Facebook has grown very, very quickly, you know? And yet to have these kind of thoughts, some might say to be very business savvy, others might say cutthroat, calculating, shrewd. You know, it's very apparent from those primary sources that his way of thinking is basically like, I'm doing what I gotta do. I'm sure there's other influences, like he's already then in Silicon Valley circles, well embedded, even though it's probably for only a fairly short period at that point. It wasn't that much later that Sean Parker was removed from the company as well. He'd come in and become president of the company, but in 2005 he was removed after the whole cocaine stunt that I was talking about earlier. And one of the things in the movie that felt like, I don't know, a little bit off, I was like, did this really happen? Was the revenge stunt they pulled on a venture capital firm. This actually did happen. Sean Parker wanted to get back at somebody from Sequoia Partners. So he convinced Mark Zuckerberg to go into a meeting at 8 a.m. Under the pretense of looking for Facebook funding, and wrote a document, or presented a document called The Top 10 Reasons Why You Shouldn't Invest in Facebook. He was also only wearing pajamas and a robe. But this didn't last for long. Sean Parker did leave Facebook, get ousted from Facebook as well in 2005. Again, like, to me, all of these dates seem so compressed, even though obviously we've got 20 years of a Facebook story to tell. But he actually stayed close to Mark Zuckerberg. He maintained a decent number of shares, and he became a billionaire during their IPO. So this brings us on to the final scenes. Saverin is gone. Parker is gone. And Zuckerberg is left alone in court depositions. An irony purposefully put there by the filmmakers, who wanted to depict the fact that the man who had, at that point, created what was the biggest online social connector of humans being left entirely alone. A contradiction that I think we're going to see over and over again through the rest of this series. In this scene, Rashida Jones's character says to Mark, "You're not an asshole, Mark, you're just trying so hard to be." Oh, such an observation. But I guess it was probably fake it till you make it. And I'm sure by the time we get to the events that are depicted in The Social Reckoning, he no longer has to pretend. But perhaps that's me jumping to judgment too soon in this series. So where did this all land in this origin story of Facebook? The Winklevosses and Divya Narendra, they received a $65 million settlement, which included some cash and some Facebook shares. They also went on to be 6th in the Beijing Olympics. Not Narendra, just the Winklevoss twins. At the end of the movie, they tell us that the Eduardo settlement was unknown, but that there was a settlement. He was also restored to be named as a co-founder of Facebook at that time. So whilst the movie says that it was undisclosed, it's now known to be approximately a 5% package, which resulted in 53 million shares during the IPO. 53 million Facebook shares were worth 2.18 billion. Fighting that fight was financially worth it for him, and he has sold some of those shares to fund a venture capital firm. Isn't it interesting? Like, it's so funny to see that these people had not that much startup or entrepreneurial experience, but they've become like reasonably big players in this field. Of course, they've got way more experience now and they've done other ventures since then, but it's crazy, again, like how quickly so much of this happened. Talk about like hitting a zeitgeist at the right time. At the end of this movie, Facebook had 500 million users, it was worth 25 billion, and had users in 207 countries. But that's not the end of the story for Facebook or for Mark Zuckerberg, and we will come on to that in future episodes. So shall I give you a full devil ranking reveal? Having teased it earlier on, I've obviously exposed the fact that Peter Thiel is extremely problematic for me, and that is a big understatement. I will be making future content on him, his story, his influence, not only over the tech business world and the American political scene, but also over all of our lives. Given we're leaving Sean Parker in this part of the story, what about him? He has an institute, the Parker Institute for Cancer Immunotherapy, the Sean N. Parker Center for Allergy and Asthma Research, which he put in millions of dollars. He's also established a center for voice disorders and has done other work in terms of eradicating disease and promoting civic tech. Now, a lot of these things seem like pretty big numbers, but he is a billionaire, so actually putting a couple of million here, a couple of million there, isn't that big of a deal. But certainly earlier in his life, there were several controversies that went along. He does stand up for certain political causes as well, such as gun control, marijuana legalization, and higher taxes on the rich. I mean, here's to more billionaires asking for higher taxes on the rich. I'm not going to call him a devil. I'm going to say he's human. Still, definitely lots of questions there for me. So, if you've made it this far, let me know in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. We will be looking at the rest of the meta story over the next few weeks. And don't forget, if you want to see other founder stories, I've got plenty already in my videos. So head on over there and have a look at the most recent one being a deep dive into Fei Fei Li and World Labs. Hope you have a lovely day and I look forward to seeing you soon.